All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this very exciting book launch of Aaron Jaffe's fabulous book, Social Reproduction Theory and the Socialist Horizon, Work, Power, and Political Strategy. I'm Sue Ferguson. I'm going to facilitate and say a few comments about the book and then introduce my fellow panelists, which actually I'll do that first in a second, but I just wanted to first, as I say, welcome everybody to the session and let you know how excited I am certainly to be part of this and honored to have been asked to help Aaron promote this book because it's a very, very important book. So before I say my own comments, I will just briefly tell you who else is on the panel and how the panel will unfold. We have the first speaker after me will be Alan Sears, who teaches sociology at Ryerson University. And then we have Ashley Borer, who's a scholar activist based in Chicago, and she currently teaches at the University of Notre Dame. And then we have Aaron Jaffe, who will respond and say whatever he would like to say about his book. He is the assistant professor of philosophy and liberal arts at the Juilliard School in New York and on the editorial board of Spectre magazine. So that's who you'll be hearing from. As per usual with these events, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. I think I'd prefer, although if you do the Q&A, I'll try to watch the Q&A too. And then we'll turn to your questions and comments after everybody's had their time speaking here. So without further ado, I'll just say a little bit more about the book and then pass it along to my panelists. So as I say, this is a huge pleasure for me to introduce this book and to be on this panel with these amazing scholars and activists. They're people I respect incredibly. But Aaron's book is a much needed, I think, explication of social reproduction theory. But beyond that, it's an expansion and deepening of SRT as a framework of analysis and as a framework for political action too. And it comes at a time and it's also a real contribution to a certain, I think, a sort of maturing of social reproduction theory. There's been an uptick of interest in it since 2008, 2009, and where people were beginning to see how it posed certain possibilities for moving past dualistic frameworks and multiple vectors of oppression, trying to understand capitalism as a more holistic entity. And so there were lots of questions and interests in it, but as I say, lots of questions and lots of ambiguity, I think, about what exactly social reproduction theory is and how it had it really moved beyond its sort of dualistic legacy. And so we had a real period in the last 10 years or so and more of getting our feet wet, those of us who are working in it, spreading the word about it, but also, grappling ourselves with trying to sort out exactly what it was that we were doing. And I think it's gotten to a stage now where we have a more confident voice, and there's an international interest in the theory and the politics of social reproduction. And we're seeing it kind of being taken up in different fields of research too, and political action, which is really, really great. So Aaron's book, I think, reflects that fact a little bit and aims to articulate that more coherent, confident statement of what social reproduction theory is and its theoretical and political agenda together. Before I sort of talk about it a little bit more, I just want to point out it's part of a Pluto series. It came out with Pluto in a part of a series that Tiffany Bhattacharya and I co-edit called Mapping Social Reproduction. And it came out, I just find it interesting, it came out at the same time as Pierre Illner's book. I'll do a little promo for Pierre here, which is called Disasters in Social Reproduction. Both Aaron and Pierre's manuscripts were commissioned and committed to well before the pandemic hit. And both came out last year during the pandemic. And fortunately, both of them were able to add a section, a chapter that addressed the pandemic. But even if they had not been able to do that, they would have been invaluable resources for radicals trying to make sense of this period. Pierre's book puts the last year and a half in historical context, analyzing community responses to past social and environmental crises in light of the shifts of US emergency aid policies. And he uses that history to make a political point, showing that the power and potential when social reproductive work is organized from below, and at times against the state. And he uses things like Hurricane Sandy and Black Panther community programs to kind of make that point. But he also shows the dilemmas that arise when such initiatives become entangled with state power or become ends in themselves. So Aaron's book, though, works on a different level of analysis. It's a philosophical dissection of social reproduction theories, conceptual and ethical commitments and grounding. But it complements and expands on some of the same political concerns that we see in Pierre's book by showing how and why the socialist left response to the pandemic or other crises can and should draw upon and foreground our need-satisfying labor powers, and why SRT steers resistance towards a socialist horizon through the integration of struggles against all forms of oppression. So Aaron's book does a lot. It drills down into the conceptual premises of SRT. It tackles really big ideas about what it means to be human, what it means to labor, what it means to be free. And you know, those are massive, big ideas. But he also does that while engaging in contemporary debates around gender, ability, intersectionality, and movement politics. And he does this all with a really immensely accessible writing. It's just beautiful writing. And it's good for folks who are also just coming new into understanding what social reproduction theory is all about. So that's kind of the big overview. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time now attempting to explain in a very condensed and partial way the first steps in that critical philosophical journey that Aaron takes readers on, that come out mostly in the first 3 chapters of the book, because it sets up his engagement with other discussions that I think probably Ashley and Alan will speak to it a bit more specifically. So at a most general level, Aaron's book explains why it is that SRT is a good theory about what is bad in society and how socialism can make the world a better place. So that is, while many of us simply assume that the anti-capitalist, anti-oppression intellectual work we do and politics that we do is good, is valuable, and grounded, for me, that means grounded in a humanist, responsible, democratic ethics. Aaron's mission is to explain how and why SRT lives up to such a claim. SRT's ethical grounding derives in the first instance, he says, from its commitment to and development of a philosophical anthropology of labor, to the idea that is that to be human is to be constantly developing, exercising, and reproducing labor powers, which are our capacities to meet our needs. And those capacities get used up and need to be replenished. So this is an ontological fact or the premise of all human societies. But Aaron points out SRT recognizes it also as a historical and social fact because our labor powers and the needs they satisfy change over time and in relation to distinct social contexts. So I want to draw attention then to an important distinction that Aaron makes about this philosophical anthropological commitment, because it really sets up much of what he goes on to argue. And that is, he argues, that SRT holds the position that humans don't have labor powers. Humans are labor powers. To be human is to produce, to create, to reproduce, to recreate. And this means that labor powers are part of our, he uses the term, living personalities. They are not in principle separable from us or external to humans. So this is important for 2 reasons, both one having to do with SRT's emancipatory project, the other having to do with SRT's critical project, which are, of course, the 2 are related. So it's emancipatory project. It's understanding of what freedom is and where our resources to expand our freedom originate. That's what I mean by its emancipatory project. Because our labor powers are part of us, we always retain some element of freedom, some control over the direction of our capacities. And this is what makes it possible in the first place to push against the forces that work to constrain them. And this is really a way of talking about Marx's a deeper, more involved kind of elaboration of what Marx meant when he talks about labor power being a special commodity, because it is an embodied, lived commodity. And so to the extent that we are able to individually and collectively self-determine our labor powers and the needs they satisfy, we are self-actualizing and thereby exercising our freedom. I think that concept helps us to for determining what is and isn't an emancipatory political project when you think about what freedom is in those terms, and when you think of freedom in those terms. So the second reason this distinction between having and being labor powers is important has to do with SRT's critical project. Because labor powers are part of our living personality and not separable, Aaron points out any element of alienation of those powers, anybody trying to control those powers from outside of us, harms the very core of our being as good, the broadening and developing of human capacities as a freedom project, and condemns as bad constraints of human labor powers that prevent humans from defining and satisfying their needs. So it's a critical, so that's what its ethics are. And then to translate that into what SRT is a critical science or framework for analysis, then SRT identifies the ways in which the capitalist organization of the production and reproduction of our labor powers constrains and harms us, while also pointing to the ways that people organize against those constraints and their potential to create the social relations necessary to meet human needs in ways that, and I'm quoting Aaron here, enable and expand our living personalities. And Aaron emphasizes that from an SRT perspective, it's not just capital that constrains and harms us, that dominates our living personalities, but social oppressions too. He does a beautiful job explaining how those sort of extra market, if you will, constraints and violence that we know so well are that form the basis of racism, much sexism, etc., are constitutive of the capitalist totality, because they shape the labor powers that capital's valorization process depends upon. And so because of that, he argues the SRT emancipatory project is a fully social emancipation that aims to eliminate the violence and alienation of all life-making and expand the need-satisfying freedoms of all inside or outside of waged work. And that's why SRT is a good theory about a bad society that can point to a way of making a better socialist society. So the political commitments that flow from this ethical grounding of SRT are developed throughout the rest of the book, as Aaron tackles other big questions around ableism, the SRT legacy of gender essentialism, and its engagement with intersectionality, and much, much more. I will just end by with my own kind of evaluative ethical statement that it's a book that everybody should read, they should buy, they should read it, and they should put it into action. And it's really a wonderful book. So I will stop there, pass it over to you, Alan, to continue the discussion.
Thanks so much, Sue. That was great. And what I say will overlap a little bit with Sue's introduction. So thanks for some of the key concepts. It's a real honor to be part of a panel on this really important book. This book is a really important contribution to what Sue described as a new flurry of social reproduction theorizing that we've seen. And its timeliness, as Sue again said, is really highlighted by the pandemic emergency that's demonstrated to all of us that capitalism cannot prioritize life-making, mutuality, or care. And this book gives us a glimpse of another horizon, a socialist horizon, the possibility of another way of organizing life focused on life-making and mutuality. And that's a beautiful, powerful thing. There is an elegance of expression in this book. There's a lot of reasons to commend this book, but certainly one of the things is an elegance of expression that both captures the state of the art in social reproduction theory. It has a really clear history of social reproduction theory, and it advances key debates in really, really important ways. It is important, and there were a number of moments when reading this book when I thought, Shit, I wish I had written that. Just the beauty and elegance of the expression and so on. The core contribution of the book, I'm going to kind of build a little bit on what Sue was saying, is to focus on the way that social reproduction focuses around labor in the broadest sense as life-making and world-making, situating us as creators and makers of our world. What Aaron uses the word living personality, the everyday transformative practices marked by creativity that are so central to our humanity. And this view of human potential is opened up in the book. We are the character of our day-to-day practices, of laboring practices, mean that our human potential is always connected to what Aaron describes as the freedom to do and be otherwise. That's actually central to our experience as humans. And that means our potentials, as Aaron also says, in other words, are far broader than how we set them in motion. It's a marker of freedom as humans. To be a marker of freedom as humans is our ability to set these powers in motion. And I think that that's a beautiful framing for social reproduction theory, because then it focuses on the way capitalism constrains our creative making in every dimension of life. Class formation is a process of dispossession, subordination, and flattening that stymies our creative making, the living personality, and leaves us with unrewarding forced labor as the means to the necessities of life, rather than as fulfilling in itself. Just to quote from the book, since labor powers sold and set in motion are absolutely essential to capital valorization, any social force that contorts our living personality and does violence to our capacities can be included in what social reproduction theory criticizes when it criticizes capitalism. So this expansive vision of the way class is constituted through creative making is the basis for a really brilliant, I think, contribution to an integrative, queer, feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial, ecological, and anti-ableist Marxism that understands the way that class is constituted by differential violence and differentiating constraints. And that's central to the social reproduction of capitalist society. And therefore, class is necessarily constituted by racialization, gender, colonialism, ableism, and so on. And to me, it's a brilliant response to the class reductionist perspectives and those who see racial formation, gender formation, et cetera, as external to class relations. This is a way of integrating them together in an understanding of differential violence and differentiating constraints. And there were some specific elements. I mean, this flows through the book, and to me, it makes the book not only valuable in the area of social reproduction theory, but really as a way to produce a Marxism for these times that necessarily integrates these elements. A Marxism that doesn't speak to this integration is going to be historically irrelevant in moments like this. And Aaron provides a really important tool chest for a different kind of Marxism and the centrality of social reproduction theory in that. And I'm going to highlight a couple things that to me were just so important in the way that integrative perspective works out. One of them is the integration of disability and the way that framing operates, because so often, I mean, at times, if we've listened, people, we and I certainly include me in this, will kind of include a little, we recognize we can't not talk about disability, but this framing provides actual crucial tools for understanding the way that disability operates in capitalism, because the freedom of labor powers, as Aaron describes it, is based on a rich plurality of capacities, even when capitalist social relations force them to take the form of constrained or unrealized potentials. So there's this plurality of capacities at the center of this human making. And we are makers in different ways. We bring different things, viewpoints, experiences, and so on to this making. And that together, this making produces a beautiful ecosystem of human experience. But these different life experiences, these different ways of doing things, these different perspectives and practices contribute in a variety of ways. Under capitalism, this plurality of capacities is reduced to, through the sale of labor power as a commodity, to the single metric of the contribution to the valorization of capital. And so all these different ways that we contribute to each other and to the formation of human capacity and human community get reduced to the single lens of productivity, understood explicitly in terms of the metric of valorization of capital. And ability and disability actually appear historically in the way that we understand it now in this lens. So when Aaron writes, the oppression of disability in particular helps highlight the formative violence inflicted on living personalities. It's a reminder that this is one dimension of formative violence that is central to the constraint of our creative capacities. We actually lose our lack of ability to appreciate each other and ourselves for the varying things that we bring, and instead measure against by these very narrow metrics that come out of the valorization of capital. And I think that the potential for this section and the way that it's a marker of a really integrative Marxist perspective, to me is huge. And it's also a call on all of us when we look back on work we've done, or especially when we look forward to work that we're continuing to do. To remind ourselves that often these frames get naturalized, and something like ability, disability gets taken for granted and naturalized and either forgotten or addressed only marginally, as opposed to thinking, no, this is central to the frame. And I think that's incredibly powerful. I think that is connected to a broader way that Aaron has integrated in the queering of social reproduction. And denaturalize the gendered division of labor. He looks at historical debates that have in certain ways naturalized gender divisions of labor, and denaturalizes the gender divisions of labor that are at the core of capitalist organization of social reproduction. On page 115, Aaron says, we, in other words, are makers of gender. It's produced and socially reproduced. And gendered divisions of labor are therefore denaturalized as historically specific products of capitalist social relations. And the queering also highlights the way that resistance to gendered social relations is actually central to this dynamic life-making capacity, to living potential, a living personality. The reproduction of spaces of resistance, of life-making communities, trans, queer, etc. communities, is a crucial example of the human potential, the creativity with which we challenge the system. And I certainly look forward, as a small note, to reading Transgender Marxism. My copy has yet to arrive, which I think will complement Aaron's work really, really well, and will help us all develop our understanding in this area. Books like this, I'm going to spend my last few minutes by saying, on the one hand, books like this need to be celebrated as a contribution, but they also, to me, are an invitation to all of us to do further work. So I'm not saying this meaning, Aaron, you should have done further work, because there's only so much that can be done within any one book, and this book is a brilliant contribution. But I'm going to highlight 3 points to wrap up with that I think we all need to work more on to kind of build on this important contribution. Number one is the state. Capitalist state, Marxist state theory, for various reasons, I would argue, has been somewhat marginalized within Marxist theoretical development over the last period of time, having to do with the somewhat marginalized status of Marxism, the decline of organizations, and so on. And I think that there's more that we need to talk about the specificity of the capitalist state in social reproduction. And Aaron points to this in various places in the book. Page 93 talks about the specific role of education systems, for example, in the social reproduction of racialization, and talks about the carceral state as well, and the fact that reform is not enough. And I think we need to go further in terms of developing this really, really important element to understand how the privatization of labor power in capitalist societies, how free workers, which is not all workers, but free workers own their own bodies, and the competition between capitalists creates a need for the state to act to shape population around the needs of capital. And so citizenship formation, education, healthcare, welfare, and so on develop out of the need to shape the population. And so social reproduction is shaped through a variety of state processes. And these state processes emerge both from above through state policymakers and so on, but also from below in certain ways as pressure on the state pushes things like a different understanding of what it means to live, different ideas of access to education, and so on. And yet, even in the presence of mobilization from below, capitalism is always centered and prioritized. So I think we need to talk more about the specificity of the capitalist state in social reproduction. Secondly, I think that, again, Aaron points to this, and I think we can go we need to go further in terms of the ecological implications of this perspective on social reproduction. That if we center creative making, it also highlights our relations with the ecosystem around us, and where transformation has become focused on an idea of mastery over nature, for example, and how that's happened and what that means in terms of our day-to-day relations with each other around social reproduction. Leanne Simpson, an Indigenous scholar activist, has written about how her Indigenous nation was focused on relations of reciprocity with each other, with other peoples, with other species, with the ecosystem. Dispossession sets out to destroy that reciprocity. And books like Aaron's, we're all talking about social reproduction in the absence of relations of reciprocity or mutuality, or rebuilt to some extent from below in resistance, where mastery and domination become central to our ecological understanding. And I think that there's an ecological framing of social reproduction that we can work more on. I was going to say a little bit more about labor, but my time is really up. So really all I want to say to wrap up is that this book is a wonderful contribution, incredibly readable, very inviting, elegantly expressed, but also a real contribution to our collective understanding. And what I look forward to, and I hope that in panels like this, we can be part of this process, is workshopping together to figure out what do we do with all that we've learned from this powerful book and other books that have developed around it. And what do we do next? But that's based in part on engaging with and understanding this wonderful contribution. So thanks, Aaron, and thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Alan, and then over to you, Ashley.
Thanks. Before I dive into talking about Aaron's book, I just wanted to, even though acknowledgements like these are limited in terms of their like effects, I did want to start by saying that I am zooming in today from the south side of Chicago, which is on the unceded homelands of several indigenous tribes, including the Council of the Three Fires. I think there can be no conversation about oppression, exploitation, care, or social reproduction that does not begin from the fact that those of us in the US and Canada who are not Native live and love and reproduce ourselves on stolen land. And there can be no solution, no liberation, and no socialism that does not reckon with this absolutely foundational fact. What I want to talk about today a bit is less about parsing all of the wonderful arguments that Aaron has in this book. And as will be clear in just a minute, I really do think it's a really wonderful book that everyone should read. I really want to talk about the experience of reading this book inside the pandemic and reading it with a group of young people that I was teaching this semester. I want to start by thinking about, the ways that the pandemic has itself exposed a kind of crisis of care and a crisis of life making and life producing in a variety of ways, ways that like Erin obviously couldn't have anticipated but there is something really special and prescient about a book that can be so useful at the time that it is released, because we write them beforehand. So there's something really special about that. And I want to start just by saying that yesterday was the anniversary of the abolition of slavery in Colombia. And I was listening to a panel discussing the ongoing state and capitalist violence in the country, and also the ongoing mobilization and resistance. And there, one of the panelists explained that one of the sources of the mass mobilization of Colombian youths that we've been seeing for the past month or so, has to do significantly with the way that the violent economic upheaval of the pandemic has forced them into caring roles that they otherwise wouldn't have occupied. Young women in particular were dropping out of university and quitting their jobs in order to care for ill family members and younger siblings in previously unfathomable numbers. And this panelist also said that over the course of the pandemic, 2.5 million Colombians fell beneath the poverty line for the first time, the largest such plummet in Latin America. And here, where I am in the US, I think the dynamics have been quite similar. So we know the ways that the pandemic has fundamentally restructured the way basic social reproduction happens, right? The impossibility of being asked to be full-time carers and teachers to young ones while working either from home or in person, cooking all of our meals at home without the occasional respite of being able to pay someone else to do it, right, in a restaurant, and the rapid spreading of the virus and therefore death at facilities specifically designed for care, right? Nursing homes, rehab centers, hospitals, sort of brought into the fore the particularly eerie and painful realization that the places we turn to for care also contain the specter of danger and death. Here too, women who have historically been responsible for the vast majority of social reproduction left paid work in droves in order to cover this gap. And then there were /R, right? We're still living through it, /R, all of the ways that the drastic changes in both our working conditions and our social reproduction conditions generated heightened anxiety, fear, pain, and grief in ways that our normal structures of care were most often not at all equipped to deal with. And all of the ways that we really, really, really tried to be there for each other, even to care across Zoom screens and masks and 6 feet of physical distance, and to step in for each other where mental health care was insufficient or inaccessible, basically to help each other survive. And so inside this massive crisis, right, and this massive international global crisis, what Achille Mbembe would call a planetary crisis. It was in this context that I read Erin's book, and in this context that I taught Erin's book to a group of young people. And so rather than doing the traditional book talk, I just want to talk a bit about what it was like to teach this book against those background conditions. And the first thing I want to start with is that I think teaching is always care work. And I think we don't think about it that way, but those of us who are teachers can say so often that really what we're doing most of the time is not filling bits of content into heads that then they spit back out at us, or hopefully we're not doing that. But it's really a process about caring for young people, caring about their journeys, helping them navigate academics, but also so much more than that. And in the pandemic, so many of us have really been at the forefront of feeling our jobs as care work, as the mental health conditions, the stress, the anxiety, the ways in which we generally try to or are told we should for professionalization, separate our home lives and our work lives. That myth has totally disappeared in the pandemic. And I think that has brought up the care function of teaching work so much more over the past year than previously. And so in this context, I was reading this book with a group of young people, and part of what was so powerful about it was giving young people an analysis and a vocabulary to explain the massive shifts of life and social reproduction in the midst of the greatest crisis of care in their lifetime. right? At the same time that they were reading this, the students were navigating their own family and kin networks' responses to the crisis, right? They were caring for younger siblings. They were trying to find ways to make sure that their elder parents were cared for. They were enmeshed in new responsibilities for care and new complications in their own mental health and in securing healthcare for themselves. And quite honestly, at the same time that my students were navigating their own responses to this crisis, I was navigating my own. And like so many of us who work with others, I was constantly confronted, and I will admit sometimes daunted, by the question of how I could care for them when I needed so much care myself. And so in a certain way, teaching this text was its own form of care for both them and for me. Bell Hooks has a beautiful essay called Theory as Liberatory Practice, which I also taught this semester, in which she explains that theory can be a healing endeavor if and when it gives us a way to name our pain. And what I found this semester is that opening the space for theory to be healing is itself a form of care work. I should back up a little bit, probably. It's a bit of a running joke with my students that all of my classes are just uniformly depressing. How could they not be, right? Like, I think and teach and write about like all of the overwhelming multi-level violence, brutality, oppression, and exploitation that structure our lives. It's pretty much a downer, right? Like cracking the ideological veil of capitalism doesn't kind of naturally make for sunny work. But how can you teach about depressing texts and depressing concepts? How can you teach about violence in the midst of so much violence? Can't that be a motive of anti-care, right? A re-traumatization? How cruel is it to approach a group of young people living through the worst moment of their lives and say, oh yes, but actually it's so much worse than you know. And I'll say that I think that that approach in like by radical teachers or teachers who teach radical theory is also something I find a lot in activist circles, right? The intense, like, we must tell people how exploited they are. We must explain their violence to them. We have to give a technical vocabulary to people how bulldozed they are by their job, their boss, the cops, the economy, whatever it is. We need to tell them how bad it is. And I think there's some value there. I think it is helpful to be clear about violence and where it's coming from, to name our pain, to name the brutality that is done to us. But I also find that this approach, while it does generate the conditions to think the problems that we're facing, it can often construct activism and social movement sites, as well as the classroom, as sites that are wholly about pain, violence, and everything in the world that we want to destroy. And so from my perspective, it's kind of no wonder that burnout and apathy and despair characterize so many spaces that we could sort of call a kind of generalized left malaise. How could it not be when all we talk about is how much things are terrible? And this is where I think Erin's book does such a better job than so many other left radical books, especially left radical books written by people with PhDs. Because it both gives us a language to, in Bell Hooks' terms, name our pain, but it also reclaims a future, an answer, and a horizon, the socialist horizon. And I think what this book demonstrates so powerfully is that the negativity of critique alone cannot get us to a world with less violence or brutality or domination. And I say this as a trained philosopher, right? Like, I'm all about the negative critique. What gets revealed, I think, when we, like Erin, join a critique that is based in social reproduction theory with a call for mobilizing toward the socialist horizon, we get a vernacular to name the violence and a way to organize and fight. And I think really what it does is it gives us something like hope, the possibility that the world can and will be otherwise. And this was a huge reframing for my students. I will say that up to that point in the semester, we had only read all the doom and gloom about like how capitalism is worse than they know. Whoops, not gonna do that again. But they really needed, right, the idea that not only can we understand what's like so fucked about the world, but that changing it is possible, and it is possible by rooting in our own power, even when, and perhaps especially when, we feel powerless. And I say that they needed it, but if I'm honest, like despite years of organizing and an entire adult lifetime of working toward the abolition of capitalism, I so desperately needed to be reminded, and more importantly, to be reminded inside community with others. So what this experience of reading and discussing this text opened up for my students and for me is a reframing of the socialist horizon by reclaiming liberation under the vernacular of care. Where Erin's book itself and the experience of reading it with others takes us is to the conclusion that another name for socialism might be a society based in liberated care for one another. I can't think of a political vision we need more in this still ongoing and worsening crisis of care in which we live. So thank you, Erin, so much for writing this book.
Thanks, Ashley. That was lovely. And Erin, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, everyone. Those were extremely generous comments, and I just also thank you for participating in this panel. I want to say a few words in particular about each of your work and how it's informed some of my own, and then maybe I'll take up some of the themes that you've laid out in your comments. So Sue's work on social reproduction theory has been tremendously important for a significant amount of time. Going all the way back to threshing out some particular debates in the Canadian scene of social reproduction for a couple decades ago. So it's been tremendously important. It's actually my first introduction, even though it's been taken up significantly and more recently it's gained some popularity. Sue is one of the original developers of the strain of social reproduction theory that I'm deeply indebted to. So thank you, Sue, and thank you for being here. Sue's more recent work, book in the Pluto Press series, Women in Work, is also tremendously important, and I suggest people take a look at it. It provides not only the intellectual history, but also the deep theoretical defense of liberatory politics rooted in the right notion of value. So I think it's an incredibly rich and promising book for radicals as well. And Alan's work on queer social reproduction is also like deeply important, and it's a tremendous honor that you're here, Alan. Your conception of queer liberation as a collective repossession of the relations needed for embodied freedom is just like, that's exactly right. So that turn of phrase is something I wish that I'd thought of, but I didn't have to because you have already done it. And so a lot of that framing is central to the way that I conceive of liberation, queer liberation, but also just liberation more broadly. Thank you. And Ashley, everyone needs to look at Ashley's recent book on Marxism and intersectionality. Like, I think that's true of everybody. Ashley's work is generous and kind to two strains of intellectual development, right? Marxism on one side, intersectionality on the other, that are far too often just ships passing in the night, or worse, on collision courses, when they, at their best, they really don't need to be. And if you're not persuaded by that, like, look at Ashley's book and we'll have a conversation afterwards. It's a really significant and an important book, and it is argumentatively rich and dense and fair, and I think even-handed, showing the intellectual roots of these strains that are too often taken to be competitive. Like a lot of the commenters today, I think, said that the book is written well, and that's actually deeply due to the editorial help. So a shout out to Rohan Quimby and Jules Gleason, who helped me make my really bad prose somewhat readable. And that just speaks volumes to their editorial like excellence, and really it's a promising for Jules Gleason's edited volume and her own writing in Transgender Marxism, which I think is going to be a nice for the development of some of the queer liberatory strains in my book. So if you haven't yet pre-order, or I guess now it's order your Transgender Marxism book. I hear that Pluto Press has had to order more shipments or more production of its first run already. Okay, to the substance of some of the comments, I wish I did say more about the state, and in particular, I wish I'd said more about the international dimension flowing from the state for that produces the ongoing legacy of colonialism and imperialism in its settler varieties, and in its the international support that different imperial states have for ongoing settler colonial projects, and in particular, at this precise moment, we have to name Palestine and the necessity of its freedom from the river to the sea. So I wish I'd said more about the international dimension and the violence sponsored by the state. I wish I'd also said a little bit more about mutuality and care. I think that you're right to notice that those are significant themes, but I didn't theorize them as appropriately or as carefully as I might have. They're not central concepts in my book, and I think they probably ought to have been. I want to be as precise as possible about life making, because I think capitalism is both a death cult, in that politicians pretend to a virtue of death as if it was a sacrifice or an honor, when it was absolutely avoidable, painful death with just a slight diminishment of profit margins to fund PPE or to retool industrial capacities for ventilators or to, shed intellectual property rights for vaccines. Like that's real. Capitalism is in fact a death cult, and it creates, as if it were a virtue, identification with it. But it is also in some ways a life-making cult, organized around needless constraint, including needless death. And I think it might be a little bit too quick to stop at a criticism of capital as producing death rather than life, because I think we can be sharp and say that the way it produces life is itself also a problem. So I wish I'd worked that out a little bit more precisely. And so thank you for the invitation to think about life making and mutuality or care. I think the conceptual key for me would be to describe life making through processes of mutuality or care and to unpack what that would mean, rather than life making through capitalist domination and all the social forms of oppression through which that domination articulates itself. I also think that Sue was quite right to plug Pierre Illner's book on disasters in social reproduction, because I think that's a place to begin looking at the state in a more domestic vein. The specificity of the state in racialization and carceral logic isn't quite there. So I think, Alan, you're right that we need to pay attention to that in particular. But the way that Pierre thinks about the state and the relation to the state from below as itself potentially criticizable is definitely worth paying attention to and sharpening out, even beyond ecological disasters or man-made disasters. But that brings me to the next point about ecology. And I saw some comments in the chat that I think I agree with. But yeah, I think we need to think about the human as an embedded life-making and practical and self-reproducing part of our ecology, not distinct from it. We need to, I think, return to a central Marxian insight that we are a metabolism with nature, that we naturalize ourselves, and although this sounds potentially colonial or dominating, we humanize nature in the sense that those two terms need to be understood in their interpenetration connection with each other. The natural and the human in both ways are mutually determining through an ongoing social history of how we metabolize in order to satisfy our needs, how we metabolize our nature and the way that we use our nature to connect to extra human nature to satisfy needs in an ongoing socially developmental and historical way. By developmental, I don't mean teleological and improving all the time. I just mean change through time. So yeah, I think we need to have an embedded account of the kind of life-making and need-satisfying powers that we articulate embedded in ecology, embedded in extra-human nature. Pay attention to the way that we change our nature and we change extra-human nature through the ongoing history. And so there's a right place for a theoretical and then practically like combined work on social reproduction theories, putting it in relation to the environment. I think that work remains to be written. And I wanted to say a word about Ashley's experience of teaching my book. First of all, thank you. That's extremely fulfilling. I wrote it with a lot of care, but writing was also for me, like a solo experience. I just woke up and I sat in a cafe and I had my coffee and I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to write for 5 hours and just let's hammer it out. And so, it's tremendously enriching to workshop ideas, to receive feedback from editors, even anonymous reviewers when the book was sent out for manuscript, the kind of social connections that happen through a text, and that I hope that you all who are listening to this talk, either live or when it gets posted online, can experience. That's a heart of what I'm looking for when I produce theoretical work. I think that theory is not just the elucidations of some compelling logical claim. I think theory has its purchase when it satisfies some need for self-clarification and can in some way satisfy a personal, social, or even motivational need to change the conditions. that we find ourselves in. So that was the case for you, Ashley, and for your students is immensely satisfying to me. Thank you very much. But I think that's all I have for now. I should open it up to, I guess, the audience's question and answer. Is that right, Sue?
Yeah, sure. And we've got, I mean, you did respond, I think, to the one question that's in the chat right now. But certainly I would invite, oh, here comes another one from Neil Braganza in the Q&A. So I'll read out Neil's. It says, a question about how to understand the idea of human flourishing in Aaron's book, the liberation of living personality and human potentiality from the violent constraints imposed on them in and for the valorization of capital. Sometimes flourishing is understood in a problematic way as freedom from the everyday strenuous physical and emotional labor of providing for others and caring for them. In such flourishing, freedom becomes a space of enjoyment and leisure that is free from that hard work. This problematic notion of flourishing would devalue, look down on care, work, and life making, and see it as a kind of prison from which we need to escape. Aaron's book, by contrast, seems to me to be clearly committed to a very different notion of flourishing. It seems to me that this is because flourishing for SRT does not seek to escape life making, but reorganize society around it. Would that be fair to say, Aaron? Could you say a few words about a Marxist SRT theory of flourishing? And can I just add, I'm actually working with a student at Rutgers on girl leisure and SRT. And so it kind of, that actually, it's a great question, Neil, because for me, it'll be illuminating to see, how, Aaron, what you sort of think about that.
Yeah, sure. I think, thank you for the excellent question, Neil. I think that what flourishing looks like is going to change over time, but we need to start in a present, and we need to start in a present by recognizing that the forms of our constraint differ. And so what leisure looks like to somebody who has to work 80-hour weeks is going to look different from somebody who has to work 40 hours a week. What leisure looks like to somebody who is being exploited by a for-profit home healthcare company is going to look different from what leisure looks like for somebody who might be doing the same amount of work, but out of love for an elder in their own family. So I think leisure is going to be important. And I also think that in the immediate experience of domination and social oppression, the kinds of leisure that we take and that we find valuable are going to be different from the leisure or forms of flourishing that we'll find compelling after the revolution. I think that there is, I draw inspiration from the idea of play and the merging of play as a kind of human activity that is enriching and enjoyable for its own sake, even though it accomplishes needs. It accomplishes need satisfaction. But I think that there's some ways that even beyond play, we could find flourishing that isn't quite the same as leisure. I think there's enriching forms of activity that might not be entirely captured by play. I can imagine still using the concept or category of work and having it be enriching. The kind of work that goes into being capable of playing well might still be considered a kind of flourishing work, or a work of developing one's capacities to flourish, and so enjoyable in that realm as well. So I appreciate the question, and I want to take just a there's no single answer to it. It's going to depend how and where we're situated, and then of course it's going to change through time depending on our social conditions going forward.
I wonder if I can just add to that too, to one question that kept coming up to me when I was reading your book, Aaron, again, was, what else are we other than labor powers? Because I struggle with this all the time, talking about life making, right? It's such a broad concept, and the idea that in fact, there are different registers and levels of life making, and that span from play to more instrumental, difficult, whatever, hard work or whatever, can we name whatever is in excess of our being other than labor power?
Yeah, I think That's a really, really important question, because there's a kind of universal or like a just kind of absolute definition. In Capital, Marx says that our labor powers are our combined mental and physical capacities to satisfy a need of any description. And so if it's a need, and if it's a thing you're doing, it's because you are capable of doing it, and that set of capacities is your labor powers. And that definition in Volume 1 of Capital makes nearly anything we do premised upon our capacity to our labor power. That's part of our, even defined by Marx in that same line as our living personality. And so, Sue, your question is there some aspect of our living personality that is not labor powers? And I think if the answer is yes, it hangs on a slightly restrictive notion of need. It would hang on that what our needs are is slightly smaller than things we enjoy, or stuff that we don't experience as a need but want to do. So maybe interest, or maybe something like I don't want to say false needs. That's an entirely different debate. But something that we do for the immediate enjoyment without sort of any a relation of choice to our labor powers, to our capacities, as a way of fulfilling an experienced and held need. So that's what I would point to as a beginning of a way to try to diminish need so it doesn't control absolutely everything we do and thereby make our entire living personalities just defined as labor powers. But that's a really tricky conceptual distinction that would require at least a whole article to fully flesh out.
Thanks. So the floor is open at this point. I don't know if Alan or Ashley, you have any lingering questions or thoughts you want to add?
I was just on that last point. I was going to say, that it seems like this definition that Marx gives sort of leaves out, or of labor power, though it is incredibly broad, maybe leaves out something like love and desire as realms that are not fully subsumable under labor power. And it would be interesting to kind of push that and think that a bit further.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting discussion. It's certainly stuff that I've been trying to think about recently. And by the way, as soon as we get to love, we also get to grief and pain. And I wonder if that broader sense of needs and the idea that work is connected to all of these things in the broadest sense of work, including love and building relationships and sexual activity in itself and so on, that I tend towards wondering whether we can have an integrative, and I think when Aaron points to play, I think the way that leisure, learning, love, caring, labor all get integrated in play is a bit of a model for thinking about this. But I think that this is all stuff that we need to kind of keep collectively bouncing off each other, because I worry it at times can get, like in my own thinking about it, it's easy to slip into a reductive idea of work. And the question is, can we always, the way Aaron connects, following Marx, connects work to potential. And if that idea of potential, and we're always producing potential as we're producing, is a very open-ended sense of it, then I'm wondering whether we do need to see something outside of that or not. And I don't have an easy answer to it. I think it's really, really interesting and exciting to grapple with. I thought it was a beautifully stated question, beautiful answer. And I just think we're all going to be grappling with that one for a while, because it's really, it's important. And it's also incredibly exciting, because to me, a lot of that is really about the Socialist Horizon. It's so often that the Socialist Horizon has been expressed historically simply around relief from the pain of capitalism, which is great, that we need that relief from it, but also that it's a huge unleashing of our human capacity to create, to love, to care, to build, to learn, and so on. And I think Aaron's captured a lot of that in the book. I think that stuff we need to keep working on.
Just to add one more and 1.5 more fingers on that I actually, I really love Alan's comment about how this helps us rethink the Socialist Horizon. But I also think it helps us rethink what's happening now and how we approach the question of building towards socialism strategically. Because one of the things that I encounter a lot in like non-Marxist or not explicitly Marxist, feminist, queer, anti-racist spaces is a kind of allergy toward the reduction of human beings just toward labor power, or to the reduction of like the vast network of human experience and ways that, you know, collective and individual experience to labor. And that's like seen a little bit in some of the feminist and queer and anti-racist spaces at, you know, and disability spaces that I'm in, as like the problem with Marxism is it can only understand us as laborers and can't understand what we are in surplus over that. And I don't agree with that critique. Like I don't think that we as Marxists can't think that, but I do think there's some truth in that we don't often think about it, because the thing that we're trying to foreground is the way in which our lives are incredibly conditioned by the, you know, material conditions of our lives, which are so inframed by labor and capitalism. And I think there are also ways in which we can think about what capitalism does to us as doing it to us kind of in excess of its control over labor power, right? It's like, you know, the way that capitalism is intermeshed with heteropatriarchy and racism isn't only or isn't reducible just to control over the extraction of surplus value. I mean, this is like my whole deal in the book. If you want more about that argument, there's a lot of it. But so I think that actually like maybe keying into and pushing on this point, I'm like really excited to be thinking this collectively with all of you, but there's something that's really powerful there, I think, about pushing Marxism in a direction that is more in concert or more able to respond to the kind of, I don't know, full expression of humanity and like even like the big ways that capitalism affects us in relationship to forms of oppression and identity, that I think is like brought up by what are we beyond our labor power and what is capitalism beyond the appropriation of surplus value.
Thanks, Ashley, and both of you. I'm going to just go on with there's a couple more questions, which I am sorry I missed it first, I think. But anyway, so this is from Christian Pépin. Unfortunately, I haven't read the book of Aaron, but this panel really confirmed why I need to get it. Great. My question wants to understand the contribution of the book and SRT more generally in renewing socialist strategy. Ellen Wood succinctly characterized agency as, quote, the possession of strategic power and as capacity for collective action founded in the specific conditions of material life. Mike Davis adds that capacity is a developmental potential for conscious and consequent activity, for self-making, not a disposition that arises automatically and inevitably from social conditions. Nor in the case of the proletariat is capacity synonymous with endowment, such as the power to hire and fire that a capitalist receives from simple ownership of the means of production. How does SRT help us go beyond a limited conception of the strategic or structural power of laborers beyond waged labor production? How does social reproduction theory offer us a way to expand our understanding of the various choke points, also at the point of paid and unpaid reproductive care work? How does this understanding inform a rejuvenated socialist strategy? For example, the rank and file strategy is seen as essential to rebuilding working class power in key strategic industries. But does SRT expand how we should theorize and practice this perspective? How does SRT inform us about the types of organizations that we need to build to tap these various leverage points, both to win concessions from capital and the state, and builds the conditions for socialist transition that can build from where we go beyond the struggles that exist in the present? Sorry, that's a lot. So Aaron, do you want to take an initial stab at some of it anyway?
Sure. That's a really important question. It gets to like the practical struggle type things. But I want to add on to just the last conversation we were having, and then I promise I will respond to this, or at least point to some possible responses. Yeah, I think Ashley's absolutely right that it's important for Marxists to think about the ways that capital as a set of social relations damages not just through valorization. But what I'm trying to do in the book is also show that the ways that capitalist social relations need to be understood as patriarchal or violent against women or gender minorities, and racist and anti-Indigenous are also harming those subject to its harms in a way that diminishes their capacities to exchange their labor power for a wage, or makes them even more dependent on people who are exchanging labor powers for a wage, which is ripe for abuse. So I'm trying to tie that set of that way of understanding capitalism as a broader set of social relations into an analysis of like what's at the core of capital's like beating heart, that is profit maximization through nominally free labor power. Okay, but Pepin's question, I am extremely lucky to have a brilliant comrade, Kate Doyle Griffiths, who has written a 3-part response to these exact questions, integrating social reproduction theory through the rank and file strategy developed by Kim Moody. I'd like to point you to the 3-part essay called "The Rank and File Strategy on New Terrain," where Kate develops social reproduction theory through nurses, through striking teachers, pointing to the ways that that people who are either at the point of production in profit-generating industries or not profit-generating industries are really at the forefront of strike waves, are really at the forefront of militant organization within their unions, and that they have significant promise because they are operating at the choke points of social reproduction that are experiencing crises through underfunding of public education, or through just the nursing and care industries are pretty close to collapse and are still under significant strain. So I think that it's a really important and strategic question, and with just a few minutes, I'm not going to do service to it, but anything I'd say would be just so deeply influenced by Kate Griffith's 3-part article that you should probably, that's a really promising place to look. It's in Spectre, and it was posted, I think, a few months ago. It's a response to Kim Moody, or it's developing in a kind of critical but also generous account of the rank and file strategy developed by Kim Moody for today from a social reproduction standpoint.
And Erica has posted a link to it in the chat. Thanks, Erica. So
thank you.
Yeah. The floor is open at this point. Again, if there's no questions from the audience, which will give you time, obviously I'll watch for them, but but Ashley or Alan, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to this point. No. So I don't know about this question that I want to ask you, Aaron. Going back and forth on it. One of the things, so Tiffany and I have been involved with Chinzia and Sarah Ferris in Britain, and some other folks about just beginning to set up a SRT network focused around the state, actually questions around the state, and we're just getting funding going. Like it's not yet set to go, but very initial stages of kind of thinking it through. But one of the reasons we're doing that is because SRT is, I think, as I said at the beginning, kind of maturing into this kind of field of study in a way that it hadn't really been recognized as such until now. And one of the things that fields of studies have are methodologies. and I've never been a methodologist, I guess. So, which is maybe to my discredit, I don't know, but I'm just wondering if you or any of the three of you have thoughts on what an SRT methodology looks like, or would look like, or could look like. I know that's a question out of the blue, but it's a question that's been on my mind recently, so I'll just pass it along.
So I think the first thing that I'd say would be if we're thinking about the state and we're thinking like an international group, I think we got to pay attention to immigration and borders. And I think that an SRT methodology, and this is something that Ashley has paid attention to in your article on SRT migrationist work. Yeah, so I think that a methodology at the international level of research would have to pay attention to the way powers and capacities for making and remaking ourselves and our social horizons are influenced by state control of like flows of people. And that becomes tremendously important. The more we'll see environmental change, forced migration, the more we'll see destabilization through unmet need, forced migration. And I think we're going to see states, as we already see in Europe, extending into Turkey, and the US extending further and further south, border regimes that aren't only analyzable through the concept of supposedly autonomous states, but like the international relations aspect becomes really significant there. So I think a methodology would have to pay attention not just to the unit of the state, but to the net effects on population flows.
I would also say, like, so it's funny, both Aaron and I are trained as philosophers, and we're like notoriously anti-methodological. Like philosophers are just like, I don't know, I think a thing and I made an argument about it. That's a method. Like I read books and then I say what I think about those books, right? Methods. But so maybe you don't want to listen to me on methodology at all. But my thought about SRT is that one of the things that makes it, I think, so capacious and so powerful as like a domain of study is that one can approach this question from several methodological endpoints. Like there's a way to like contribute to SRT in a kind of more philosophical, theoretical way that is about unpacking some of the concepts of, you know, of social reproduction. There's a way to do like a discourse analysis around the like way that we understand and value social reproduction or don't. There would be a way to track like in some sort of quantitative way, or at least in some sort of empirical way, like the transformations in social reproduction alongside various kinds of policies of the state or corporations. So I wonder if maybe there's a different way to think about social reproduction theory, not as like, you know, a unified singular field of study that has a particular, that necessitates a particular kind of methodology, but more as like a field of study that requires thinking about certain kinds of considerations or something, that it's like a framework that one can use and put into several kinds of methodologies. I don't know if that's helpful. Don't listen to me.
It confirms my predisposition.
If I can just,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, no, just really briefly, because I know that time is flitting and that we have to end promptly, but I think Aaron's book actually models in certain ways an essential of that methodology and argues for it, which is a historical methodology. And we sometimes think historical methodologies means necessarily delving into the deep past. That's not necessarily. The core of it is understanding this historical process of formation, where the end result, which is what we see, often gets naturalized. And I think Aaron modeled that methodology in the book, if not self-consciously, at least it's there. And I do think that that is because of the way these historical processes of formation work. If we don't inquire into those processes, we end up taking their end result as a given. And so I think any social reproduction approach to the state needs that historical element, but what we understand historically as a methodology is much different than the craft version in the discipline of history, for example. And yeah, and thanks. I can see we have 2 minutes left, so thanks.
Yes, yeah, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the participants and the wonderful questions. I'll also point out that someone has plugged Ashley's translation of François Berger, A Decolonial Feminism. So in the chat, so I just don't want people to miss that, and there's a reference to Kate's article as well. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Aaron, for writing the book. Thank you to Ashley and Alan for your brilliant comments, and thank you to, as I say, the audience for chiming in and being there. So, all right, take care, and see you next year, maybe in person.
And thanks to Elise for the support.
Oh, thank you, Elise. I'm sorry.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you can enjoy the rest of the La Grande Transition.
You too. Good luck with all your work.
Bye-bye, everybody. I'm going to close.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.